February 1931, a popular American magazine called Modern Mechanics and Inventions ran an intriguing feature on the Great Wall of China. Claiming to have gained access to exciting plans by Chiang Kai-shek's new government in Nanjing, the article described Chiang's intent to convert the Great Wall into, quote, one of the greatest and most unusual motor highways on Earth. Beneath the headline, we find an amusing sketch of what such a highway might look like, with watchtowers turned into gas pumps. This elevated boulevard would extend some 1,500 miles west from Beijing. And to help its readers conceptualize that number, the article added a map of the Great Wall superimposed on a map of the United States. Apparently, the finished roadway would span the equivalent distance of Denver to Washington, D.C. Better yet, according to this article, because the Great Wall remains in, quote, a remarkable state of preservation, the necessary repairs to turn it into a Chinese superhighway would not be exorbitant. As you might have already guessed by now, a Great Wall National Highway was never built in China. But it's a good example of the inventive hyperbole that the wall has inspired over the centuries. The Great Wall, it has often been claimed, is the only man-made structure that is visible from the moon. A marvelous stone caterpillar that crawls unbroken for thousands of miles across the rugged landscape of northern China. We are told that it's a truly ancient wonder, built in the 3rd century BC and had never fallen out of use, a formidable barrier that has kept the Mongols and countless other invaders out. The only problem with all of this? Well, none of it is even remotely true. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that the legend of China's Great Wall is one of the biggest modern misconceptions still widely embraced by the public. But don't just take my word for it. In 1987, the year the Great Wall was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a team of foreign experts traveled to China to gather hard empirical data to support all these incredible tales. Unfortunately, as one Chinese scholar has conceded, this team of experts was, quote, flummoxed by the task, unable to obtain sufficient data to provide a definitive scientific conclusion regarding the overall length or age of the structures. Now, you might think that one of the world's most famous monuments would be better documented, but it turns out that this is simply not the case. All those maps you see, with their confident illustrations of crenellated walls winding their way continuously across northern China, can in fact be traced to a fanciful map drawn up by Jesuit missionaries in the early 1700s. And that claim that the wall can be seen from the moon? That tall tale was first spun in 1754, centuries before advances in rocketry could have verified such a claim. And until the past couple of decades, virtually no on-site archaeological research had ever been undertaken on the remains of the wall. In fact, no accurate map of the walls built across northern China has ever been based on actual eyewitness fieldwork. And yes, walls in the plural. That we're talking about a single continuous wall is the biggest myth of all. In fact, there are dozens of walls stretching across northern China, and many stretches are not even connected. They were built across different centuries, along different routes, with different methods and materials, some as early as the 5th century BC, and some as late as the 17th century AD. There isn't really a Great Wall at all. So in this lecture, we're going to dispel the many myths and replace it with a sober-eyed assessment of the many great walls in Chinese history, and explore what they can and can't tell us about Chinese civilization itself. Like most ancient civilizations, the Chinese have built walls of one sort or another since the beginning of recorded history, and even before. Thousands of years before the Chinese script appeared in the year 1250 BC during the Shang dynasty, Neolithic settlements in northern China were enclosed by prehistoric earthen walls. During the latter half of the first millennium BC, a time of incessant warfare among tens of independent states, any city that served as an important political base was prudently surrounded by a wall. Today, The only remaining city wall of any size in China are the fortifications which surround the ancient city of Xi'an, itself a World Heritage Site. For most of its history, though, a wall like this would have been built of tamped earth, just soil, rocks, and other debris dumped into a wooden frame, pounded down for layer after layer, and then coated with a veneer of lime or sometimes blood. It was only in the last 500 years or so that the Xi'an city wall was faced with more durable stone and brick. As for all those other tamped earth walls, almost nothing remains of them today, and they are often barely distinguishable from the surrounding landscape. Around the year 400 BC or so, Chinese cities began to face a new threat. For this was about the time at which some brave person figured out how to ride on horseback. Though the horse had already been long domesticated by this point, it was mostly used just to pull things, a chariot or a plow, for instance. But once you could sit on a horse, the entire landscape of war changed overnight. Now, a small number of people living on the margins of wealthy sedentary societies had the means to turn the tables in their favor. First, because these newly empowered nomads could now choose the site of every battle, they could ensure that conditions were always in their favor. And second, because they were able to move swiftly from pasture to pasture every season, nomads generally lacked a fixed base of subsistence from which they might be attacked. These two simple advantages seriously vexed the Chinese, because now a small number of nomads could defeat armies put forth by states with populations thousands of times their size. They did this by overextending supply lines, conducting strategic border raids, monopolizing the supply of horses bred on the steppe, and the always effective fake retreat followed by an ambush. In the 2nd century BC, a Han Dynasty official gave voice to Chinese frustrations. The population of the Xiongnu, he said, referring to the most powerful nomadic confederation of his day, does not exceed that of a large Chinese district. That a great empire has come under the control of the population of a district is something that your minister feels must be a source of shame for those who are in charge of the affairs of the empire. Now, in response, the Chinese began to build walls. Not city walls this time, but winding frontier walls intended to plug up gaps in the rugged landscape that gave access to the North China Plain. These early walls first appeared during the second half of the 1st millennium BC, in the centuries immediately following the mastery of horseback riding. But don't mistake these for the Great Wall either. Just like those early city walls, these first frontier walls were little more than tamped earth. You can still see a few remnants of such walls in the Gobi Desert, partially preserved in the sand thanks to the dryness of the area. But it usually takes the trained eye of an archaeologist to spot their modest remains today. In the year 221 BC, the Qin state defeated all its rivals and formed the first unified Chinese empire. Facing more and more attacks from the Xiongnu Confederation, the first emperor of the Qin dynasty significantly expanded the frontier wall system. Not only that, but he also linked together many of those that had been built by those rival states he had just vanquished. Now, due to the notorious mythology that later sprung up around the first emperor, his walls would later be identified as the origins of the walls we see today, which were supposedly built on top of them. But there is simply no empirical evidence for this, and Chinese historical sources make no references to long walls constructed of brick and stone. It is far more likely, as recent archaeological research has shown, that the Qin walls were also made of tamped earth. A few are still visible today, but they're hardly worth the trouble of visiting. Just low mounds of earth covered in scruffy vegetation. If you didn't know it was a wall, you'd probably think it was just a natural feature of the landscape. Now, the first walls that were fundamentally different from those old tamped earth barriers were built during the ensuing Han Dynasty. Unlike the Qin, who only lasted 15 years, the Han would rule from 206 BC to 220 AD, more than 4 centuries. This gave them ample time to explore the full range of policy options for dealing with those troublesome Xiongnu nomads. But walls weren't the first choice, or even the second. The first choice was to go to war. In 200 BC, the first Han emperor embarked on a risky offensive campaign into the northern steppe. The inevitable result, as many future emperors were also to learn, was the emperor's encirclement and near capture outside the present-day city of Datong. Once war was off the table, the Han turned to diplomacy. This took the form of a policy known as heqin, or peace through marriage. It involved sending Chinese princesses to the steppe as brides, opening border markets for trade, bestowing titles of equality upon the nomadic Khan, and the provision of annual subsidies. But to many Chinese officials, this peace through marriage policy was humiliating, and it still didn't solve the actual problem. The Xiongnu simply used all these new resources to recruit more followers, and these new followers in turn demanded more silk, more silver, and more princesses. So eventually, the third and least desirable option was adopted: permanent fortifications along the northern frontiers. Now, contrary to popular myth and all those maps you've seen before, no dynasty built continuous walls across the thousands of miles of northern frontier. Instead, they concentrated their resources on 3 major passes through which nomadic armies were most likely to invade. These are Yumengguan in the northwest, Juyongguan in the north, and Shanhaiguan in the east. For the Han Empire, the chief choke point against the Xiongnu was the Hexi corridor in the northwest. Here they built Yumengguan, or Jade Gate Pass, whose remains were discovered by the Hungarian-British archaeologist Aurel Stein in 1907. The ruins of the Yumengguan complex include a brick fort, a granary, and a few modest walls. The bricks consisted of local materials: grass, reeds, earth, and gravel, all of which were poured into a mold with water, then dried out in the desert sun. Archaeological work in the brick fort has revealed the remains of unburnt straw intended for use in signal fires, along with permits that authorized its burning. 1 stack of combustible vegetation, 3 beacon fires, and 3 torches should be lit, the permit reads, when more than 500 but less than 1,000 enemies assault our tower. Also littering the ground are wooden slips that record the issuing of grain rations to the soldiers stationed out along this lonely frontier post, as well as the grisly reports of mortality rates. One slip notes, in mundane fashion, that 14 people had died in a single day, and not from wounds suffered in battle. There are also a handful of ruined walls near Jade Gate Pass. The Ma Jianwan Wall is a good example of the modest materials employed in their construction. Its badly eroded remains consist of up to 20 layers of reeds and tamarisk branches, topped with sandy gravel and pounded down on top of the previous layer. When first built, they would have reached nearly 20 feet tall. Today, they are little more than raised stumps struggling to rise above the desert floor. After the fall of the Han Dynasty in the 3rd century AD, we have to wait a considerable amount of time before we find another dynasty engaged in building frontier walls. For the next 1,000 years, most of the states that ruled the North China Plain were hybrid empires that were founded by a prudent alliance of nomadic peoples and northern Chinese military families, including the Tang, Liao, Jin, and Yuan dynasties. Needless to say, empires that incorporated nomads into their ruling classes did not need to build walls to defend against themselves. The only significant unmixed Chinese state during this time, the Song dynasty, didn't hold northern China long enough to ever get to the point where they would consider wall building as a viable policy. It seems that the best approach to defending the northern frontier was not to fight the nomads, but rather to join them. If we want to find the origins of the Great Wall that you can see in tourist brochures today, then there is only one dynasty worthy of our attention: the Ming. In the year 1368, the founder of the Ming dynasty succeeded in driving the descendants of Genghis Khan out of inner China and back into Mongolia. And there, the stalemate held for the next 276 years. This fostered one of the conditions necessary for wall building to become a viable policy option: a Chinese state that is capable of holding the North China Plain, but is incapable of taking any part of the northern steppe. But there is more to this picture. The Ming rulers came from southern China, and they nurtured a particularly conceited view of the superiority of Chinese civilization vis-a-vis the northern nomadic barbarians, with whom they refused to mix. This made a policy of peace through marriage impossible to consider. But neither was offensive warfare a realistic option. In 1449, one of the Ming emperors was actually captured and taken hostage by the Mongols after leading a foolhardy campaign to the north of Beijing. So what option was left? You guessed it, walls. The vast majority of Ming walls were built during the last 70 years of the dynasty, from the 1570s until 1644. These are the walls that every visitor to China sees today. The ones that everyone thinks of when we think of a supposedly continuous Great Wall stretching back 2,000 years into history. But as long as we resist buying into the exaggerated myths about its antiquity and continuity, we can still admire the Ming walls as truly extraordinary feats of human ingenuity. What makes the Ming walls so distinctive is the material used for their construction. For the first time in Chinese history, frontier walls would be faced in stone and brick, with expert craftsmanship on display in every inch of construction. Instead of local materials at hand, mixed with dirt and covered in lime by peasants called up for corvée labor, these new walls were built with imported stone and brick by skilled masons and soldiers who were paid in silver. The bill was staggering. In 1576, at the height of Ming wall building, projected expenses for new construction and the repair of walls totaled 3/4 of Beijing's annual revenue. So what did the Ming emperors get for all their silver? Once again, they focused on fortifying those three main passes that provided easy routes of attack toward Beijing. The closest pass to the capital was Juyongguan, a forested valley that would be the natural first choice for any invading army. Here, we find the famous Badaling Fort, just 43 miles northwest of Beijing. Heavily restored in recent decades, the walls at Badaling are over 20 feet high and 20 feet thick at the base, with a slight narrowing in width toward the top. The largest stone bricks are 10 feet long and can weigh more than 1,000 pounds. But if you try to hike the Badaling Wall beyond the tourist area, you will soon find that it is not continuous. Walls like this were designed to block openings in the mountains, not recreate the mountains themselves. Not only that, but the quality of materials and general appearance changes quickly as the wall snakes away from showcase passes like Badaling. Just a stone's throw from the walls of the Juyongguan Pass, you might cast your eyes on what many assume is some sort of a grand gate, the cloud platform. But in fact, it was constructed about 150 years prior by the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty, and originally supported 3 gleaming white stupas. The cloud platform is adorned with Buddhist reliefs, many in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and inscriptions in no less than 6 different scripts can be found around it. With the cloud platform, the Yuan dynasty welcomed travelers through the pass between north and south by showcasing their diverse cultural and linguistic influences. But the Ming dynasty goes in the other direction, and when they walled up the pass, they pointedly left the cloud platform and its association with the previous Mongol-led dynasty just outside their new symbolically closed society. Now, if the fort and walls at Badaling defended against entry from the north, then the other 2 new sets of fortifications were designed to block the flanks. In the northwest, the Ming built a new fort at Jiayuguan, or Pleasant Valley Pass. Located about 200 miles east of the Han-era fort at Yumenguan, the Jiayuguan Castle Fortress rises up dramatically from the surrounding desert with snow-capped mountains in the distance. The complex includes 3 towers, government offices, and barracks, all within a square, walled compound marked by crenellated battlements. A famous plaque once hung above the main gate declaring that Jiayuguan was, quote, the first fortified pass under heaven. To guard the eastern approach to Beijing, the Ming built another fort at Shanhaiguan, or Mountain and Sea Pass. Perched on a slim but strategic strip of coastal land about 180 miles east of Beijing, the new Shanhaiguan fort blocked the road connecting North China to Manchuria and Korea. And there was no getting around it. A section of the fort known as Old Dragon's Head actually extends out into the crashing waves and ensures that no one could pass overland to Beijing without permission. The forts and walls at these 3 strategic passes are not typical of most Ming walls. They were the showcase military emblems of the emperor's scorn for the Mongols, and each has been heavily restored over the past half-century. If you want to visit a more typical wall, somewhat off the beaten path, my recommendation would be Jinshanling, or Gold Mountain Ridge. One of the most memorable moments of my life came in the summer of 2001, when I got the opportunity to hike along the top of Jinshanling for several miles. Back then, I knew nothing about the history crumbling beneath my feet. But in hindsight, I now realize what a perfect case study it is for a typical Ming wall. For even in its dilapidated state, with shrubs growing out of cracks, missing railings, and crumbling flagstones, Jinshanling still impresses. The first task for Ming engineers was to lay down a solid stone foundation. Unlike those old, tamped earth walls, Jinshanling is built on top of finely cut large stones at the base to stabilize the wall above it. Of course, much of the interior of the wall was still a combination of earth, rocks, and vegetation, but now these are all faced on the outside with large bricks fused together with a mortar that consisted of lime and sticky rice paste. In 1985, Chinese archaeologists discovered the remains of a kiln near one of the Ming walls that was capable of firing 500 bricks at a time. On one of the bricks, they even found a serial number, left 3, that traced its production back to a specific kiln. Such marks made it possible to figure out who was responsible for defective bricks. In all, it is estimated that each meter of wall at Jinshanling required 22 full firings of a kiln. That was a massive strain on local and imported fuel sources such as wood, coal, and dung. And that was only if the bricks were locally produced. One brick was found stamped with a place of firing that was 50 miles away. Transportation of such heavy materials was no mean feat. In the days before mechanized power, every one of these bricks was carried by human muscle, usually piled into baskets that were attached to a pole slung over the shoulder. In the steepest sections of the Ming Wall, such as the gravity-defying heights of Simatai, poles and baskets could not be safely balanced. So instead, they formed a literal human chain up the ridge to pass bricks hand over hand up the precipitous slopes. But building a wall was only the first step. To be effective, the walls had to be manned, and that meant adding watchtowers at regular intervals. In the most vulnerable and strategic passes, watchtowers were often within sight of each other, but elsewhere they could be spaced up to 2.5 miles apart. Ming sources tell us that a single watchtower took 400 men about 4 months to build, or roughly 48,000 man-days of labor. Though some towers had a solid core, most were hollow inside, like this picturesque watchtower at Jinshanling. This interior space allowed them to be provisioned for months at a time. When operational, watchtowers like this were manned by anywhere from 30 to 60 soldiers, who served 4-month tours of duty in either the spring or the autumn. Everyone knew that tours of duty in the fall were far more dangerous than in the spring. This is because the nomads prefer to embark on offensive campaigns with horses that had been well fed from summer pastures, not the skin and bones mounts that had barely survived the winter. According to Ming reports from the frontier, soldiers stationed at these watchtowers frequently suffered from low morale and a lack of training. And can we blame them? fighting the Mongols was a hopeless task. And no matter how romantic those sunset panoramas of a Ming wall may appear today, back then, frontier duty was grim and lonely. But Ming soldiers weren't just sitting ducks. The first line of defense was scouts, who could venture as far as 200 miles north of the wall. If these scouts failed to anticipate a Mongol attack, the other early warning system were the beacon towers. Beacon towers were spaced no more than 3/4 of a mile apart, the distance at which drum beats could be heard. In addition to drums, the 5 to 10 soldiers who manned a beacon tower also made use of fire, smoke, flags, and cannon signals. One manual from 1466 stipulates the firing of 1 cannon shot for up to 100 enemies, 2 for 500, 3 for 1,000, 4 for 5,000, and, God help them, 5 for 10,000 enemies. The Ming signaling system was highly efficient and sophisticated, allowing for the relaying of simple messages over 600 miles within just 3 hours. So when the marauders did reach the walls, Ming soldiers were prepared and well defended. Crenellated battlements and holes in the wall allowed soldiers to fire from above with relative safety. If the Mongols scaled the wall, however, the defenders could retreat into the watchtowers and then its roof. All the while, they made liberal use of a range of creative weapons. Missile projectiles included crossbows, rocket arrows, muskets, cannon, along with what was referred to as a shunhuo feiya, or flying crow with magic fire that ignited upon impact. One of the most inventive weapons was the stone bomb. Its construction was simple. Take a heavy, roundish stone and bore out a hollow in its core. Add gunpowder and a fuse, light it, and toss it down over or through a hole in the wall. Then watch it explode, sending hard shrapnel everywhere. Ming soldiers could also create stone bombs from rocks small enough to hold in their hand, which was essentially an early version of the hand grenade. The final battle would be fought in close quarters with melee weapons like swords and spears. But historians believe that very few battles actually took place on these walls and towers. Northern nomads had little interest in throwing themselves recklessly against a heavily fortified brick wall. And since the Ming walls were not continuous, why not simply go around them? And remember, walls and castles are only as reliable as the men who man them. In 1644, when another nomadic group called the Manchus marched their armies toward Beijing from the northeast, a disaffected Ming general simply opened the gates for them at the heavily fortified Shanhaiguan. With the suicide of the last Ming emperor not long after that, the story of the Great Walls in China came to an end. The new Qing dynasty, ruled by a coalition of Manchus, Mongols, and northern Chinese, once again extended imperial control over the northern steppe. There was now no point in building any new walls or maintaining the old ones, since the Son of Heaven now ruled both sides of it. When you think about it, the many great walls built throughout Chinese history are not terribly different from many of history's other famous walls. Hadrian's Wall, the Berlin Wall, the Maginot Line, or even the partially built wall along the US-Mexican border. What do they all have in common? They were nobody's first choice to solve a strategic problem. Instead, they represent a compromise of last resort when other, more attractive options to keep a problem in or out have failed. And like those other famous walls, the Great Walls of China were a temporary fix at best. When Richard Nixon reopened American relations with China with a state visit in 1972, some of the most iconic photographs came from his visit to the Great Wall. After all, what could be more symbolic of breaking down diplomatic walls and pulling back the curtain on what many in the West saw as a mysterious, closed-off land? But as we've learned, what the Great Walls tell us about China has nothing to do with some supposed mentality of being closed off to the rest of the world. When you think about it, they really don't tell us much about China at all, other than that for most of its history, China had to deal with constant nomadic threats. That these beautifully crumbling emblems of political and economic conflict have come to represent the essence of Chinese civilization itself is one of the great ironies of history.